Bodum versus SterlingPro versus Frieling versus Aeropress versus Espro. But it's not about them, it's about the coffee. Are you intrigued? Stay tuned and let's talk about it here on FrenchPressCoffee.com. But why is this video important? And why has it been so long? We know this has been a long video and we thank you guys for sticking with us. Why is this important? It's important because it's good for you to know how these filtration systems are going to affect your cup of coffee, because you can adjust your coffee to water ratio, you can adjust your coffee temperature, your water temperature, you can adjust your coffee grind, you can get a different coffee grinder, things along those lines. But what you can't do in general is change the filtration system of your French press. You could certainly hack something together and change things and things like that. But let's face it, when you're going out to get a new French press, you want to make sure that you're going to get the one that fits your flavor profile and what you like the best. So this video is important because it's going to show you how those filtration systems are going to so greatly impact the cup of coffee that you're going to get from your French press. How do they make the coffee that you're going to drink, and how is the heart of these French press devices going to really affect the coffee that you're going to be drinking? Let's dive in and talk about that. So what do I mean when I say the heart? Well, I'm talking about the filtration system in these French presses, and let's just pull each of these out to start talking about them real briefly. First of all, I've got the Bodum on my right-hand side. Then I have the SterlingPro. I personally have a SterlingPro, and I really do enjoy it. Frieling French presses. I've reviewed these recently and definitely falling in love with them and considering adding one to my own at-home coffee shop pretty immediately. I've got the Aeropress right here. Nothing to really pull out here, but I'll be talking about some of the other options for brewing with it as I go along with this video. Finally, I have the Espro Press and its heart. So we've got the heart, we've got the guts of each of these French presses pulled out, and let's talk about how this is going to affect the coffee that you're making. To kick this off, let's talk about the four major components of brewing French press coffee, and really any coffee whatsoever, and how they are going to affect the cup of coffee that you're going to get. The first major component here is going to be the actual grind of your coffee. How coarse is it? How fine is it? That's going to play a huge role in the cup that you're going to get. The second is going to be the brew time. The brew time, of course, is going to be affected by how coarsely ground or finely ground your coffee is, because that's going to govern how much time it takes to actually extract the flavor out of those coffee grounds. This is a little bit of a science, of course, and so that brew time is going to make a very big difference. And then the next component after that, the third, is going to be the brew temperature. The brew temperature and the water that you're using is going to make a huge difference in the cup of coffee that you're going to get. And then finally, the water to coffee ratio. And of course, that's a pretty simple thing to figure out. How much water are you using versus how much coffee are you using? But all of these factors come together to play a really important role in the type of coffee and the cup of coffee that you're going to get when you are using French presses or even just extracting coffee in general. Now we've talked about the coffee basics, let's talk about the filtration basics and how the filtration is going to make a big difference in the cup of coffee that you're going to get. And I'll start by talking about the Bodum right over here on the right-hand side, and a single filtration system. Single is pretty straightforward. It's one piece of mesh that's going to filter your coffee out as you press your French press down. It's going to give you a different cup of coffee than some of the other ones that I'm going to talk about, such as a dual filtration system. Dual filtration in this case is two filters, both of which are the same mesh size, but of course that's going to lead to further filtration of the coffee, less grit, less coffee grounds in your cup, things along those lines. And in this case, I'm talking about dual filtration with the SterlingPro French press that I have here on the bench. Moving right along to the Frieling French press, this is where we're going to move up to dual filtration, but in this case, this is dual microfiltration, and I'll show you what that means. In dual microfiltration, we have two filters, but these are of different mesh types. In my left hand, I've got a much thinner mesh than the one that is in my right hand, and that means that I'm going to be filtering on two different levels, which of course is going to cut out a lot more sediment, grit, and coffee grounds as I brew my coffee. Then moving on to the Aeropress. The Aeropress offers some very unique ways of brewing. I have in my left hand here the Able disc. This is a stainless steel disc that you can use with the Aeropress. This is great for giving you the ability to use a reusable option for the Aeropress. It's going to create less waste and it's great for traveling. My right-hand side, I have the option that's most well known with the Aeropress, and that is brewing with paper filters. These are both going to offer, again, different levels of filtration with your coffee. Paper is very popular because paper does filter coffee very, very well. Of course, we've known about filtering coffee with paper for quite some time now, and the Aeropress has a couple different options for that. Finally, moving on to the Espro Press, which also has a very unique filtration system. This is a dual microfiltration system because, again, here we've got dual filtration systems, but with different levels of metal mesh, which are going to filter our coffee. And this is also different, as you can see from the other options that I have talked about, because this is a basket-style filtration system. This is important because this is going to stop the over-extraction of your coffee. We'll talk about how that affects things in just a moment. Additionally, the Espro presses also have the option to use paper filters. Some folks like to use paper to further filter their coffee. This can also cut down on coffee oil, which can cut down on the cholesterol that comes from coffee. Moving on to coffee grind, and this is really very important, and I'm going to give you a little bit of in-depth information here, so just stay with me and you're going to see why this is very important. Coffee grind is an important thing because, let's face it, there is no such thing as a perfect coffee grind. We can grind coarse ground coffee, and that does not mean that every single particle of coffee is going to be coarsely ground. There's always going to be some small particles. And the reason that the small particles are very important is because the extraction time of those small particles is going to be much shorter than the extraction time of the large particles of coffee. And what do those small particles do? Those small particles can impart the bitterness into your coffee. Why? Because they take less time to extract, which means that they are going to impart more bitterness into your coffee, along with your more coarsely ground coffee, which takes longer to extract. Let's say 30 seconds for smaller particles, and up to 4 minutes, the magic number, for those larger particles. Why is all of this important? The reason this is important is because your filtration system is going to help to solve that problem for you when you go to brew your coffee and finish your brew by pressing down on your French press and pouring into your cup. So let's go from right to left here and again talk about how each of these different filtration types is going to affect that based on the coffee grind that you're using. Bit of a disclaimer here, we're going to assume that you're using a good coffee grinder when you're making your French press coffee. And when I say good, I'm referring to a solid conical burr grinder. It does not have to be an expensive grinder, but it should be one that is at least a conical burr grinder of some kind or another. If you're using a blade grinder or something along those lines, you're going to get an incredibly inconsistent coffee grind, and that is going to completely throw off even what we're talking about here in this video and the different filtration systems that we can use. So just make sure that you're using properly ground coffee, and you're going to be able to follow along with us even more easily here. So starting off on the far right-hand side again with the Bodum and a single filtration system using one single mesh filter, this of course is going to definitely affect your coffee extraction in a lot of different ways. Because this is only one single filter and it is not a micro filter, this means that more of those small particles are going to get through the filter when you press down. That means that your coffee could potentially be more bitter. Now remember, there are a number of things that can affect the bitterness of your coffee, such as the type of roast you're using, the type of coffee, its origin, things along those lines. But if we're talking about what is most important to us here, the filtration, those small particles are going to make the largest difference. The more small particles that make their way through the filter, the more potential for a bitter brew that you're going to get. So that is where the single filtration system could really change things. Now that may not be bad for you. You may be looking for something that is a little more on the bitter side or has a little more of that flavor. That is perfectly fine. To each their own. Remember, flavor and taste is always subjective. What I say is not necessarily the right way, but this lets you know how this can affect your brew. Moving on to a dual filtration system, remember, not a micro dual filtration system, but in this case, simply a dual filtration system. 2 filters, same mesh type, but stacking these filters up. This, of course, means that we're going to further filter out the coffee, we're going to get less of those small particles, which is going to lead to a less bitter brew. This is also important because if you're looking at a French press like the Sterling French press that I have right here, this is going to really govern the type of coffee that you're going to get out of it. Stepping on up to the Frieling French press that I was talking about earlier, this is where things change quite drastically, and that is because, again, I have a dual filtration system, but I have a dual filtration system that also makes use of microfiltration. The microfiltration in this case is going to back up that first layer of filtration, It's going to further filter out the microparticles, which is going to give you a much less bitter brew, going to lead to less bitterness, less grit, sediment, coffee grounds, and etc. Moving on next to the Aeropress, and again, this is one of my favorite ways of making coffee, and there's a lot of people out there that agree with me, of course. There's a couple different ways of brewing at the French press, and that's going to really drastically change the bitterness level and the filtration of your coffee. With the Aeropress, we have the option to use a reusable option such as the Able filtration disc. This is a microfiltration stainless steel disc, and this is of course going to lead to much further filtration of the coffee, less small particles, which is going to lead to less bitterness. It's also worth noting that with an Aeropress, you can use a much more finely ground coffee because of the fact that the Aeropress is going to allow you to do that simply based on the way that it extracts coffee. So I can actually push a more finely ground through this tiny disc right here. But the Aeropress takes it to the next level because the Aeropress primarily usually uses paper filters. Paper filtration not only is going to catch more of the small particles, leading to a less bitter cup, it's really hard to catch coffee oils even with a really solid dual microfiltration metal mesh system, because coffee oils are actually going to be trapped in the paper in an option such as the Aeropress. Moving on to the Espro Press, this adds a couple more important factors to the filtration system and the equation that we're talking about here. And that's because this is a dual microfiltration system, makes use of two different types of mesh, both of different levels of fineness, which is going to further filter out the coffee and filter out those microparticles. But this is also going to stop the extraction process. The Espro Press is very different from other French presses because when you press down, you actually stop the extraction process. Whereas with other French presses, you're actually going to continue extracting the coffee if you leave the liquid in the French press. That's why we've said many times here on FrenchPressCoffee.com, when you make your French press coffee, you may want to transfer it to a carafe of some kind because otherwise that coffee can sit there and continue extracting, again leading to more bitter or overly strong coffee. The Espro Press is going to put a little bit of kibosh on that for you and stop that from happening because of its filtration system and because it is a dual microfiltration system. And of course, it's worth mentioning, as I did earlier, that the Espro Press will allow you to make use of paper filters. So in the case of an Espro Press, not only can you get dual microfiltration with two different mesh levels, but you can also add paper filtration to be able to absorb coffee oils, cholesterol, and anything else such as some of that bitterness that you would get when you are brewing French press coffee. So now moving from left back to the right and talking about extraction, because remember, extraction and extraction time is very important to the level of bitterness and the flavor of your coffee. Again, with the Espro Press, as I mentioned, once I press the Espro Press down, my extraction process stops. How does that happen? Well, if you look at the bottom of the Espro Press and the basket that I have right here, there's nothing on the bottom that allows coffee to go through it. That means as soon as I press down, my coffee stops making pretty much any contact with the water and the brewed coffee inside of the press, which means that it's not going to over extract. What I get is what I get when I press down. With the Aeropress, once I press down on the Aeropress, and we've talked about the Aeropress a lot here on FrenchPressCoffee.com, once I press down, I'm done. My extraction process is finished. My coffee, my liquid, is not going to make any contact with my coffee grounds anymore, which means that I'm not going to get over extraction or bitterness and things along those lines that can affect my cup of coffee. Both of these options they have right here, the Espro Press and the Aeropress, are both really well known all around the world for giving very consistent, clean, smooth, and less bitter cups of coffee. Moving on to the Frieling French Press and continuing to talk about extraction time, the Frieling French Press again is going to further extract our coffee because of the dual microfiltration system that it has, and it's going to do its best to stop the extraction process when I actually press down on the handle to stop the contact of the coffee grounds with the coffee liquid. Moving on to the SterlingPro, again, this is where we have a dual filtration system, but this dual filtration is not a dual microfiltration system. It is simply a dual filtration system. How will this affect the extraction time? Well, again, this is very similar to the Frieling French Press because this means that once I press down on that handle, I'm going to stop the extraction process as much as possible, but I can have a potential for an even, maybe a little more bitter cup of coffee than with an option such as the Frieling French Press, because remember, this is only a dual filtration, not dual microfiltration. Again, the major difference between the two of these is with dual microfiltration, less small particles. Yes, the opportunity for more over extraction, but less small particles, whereas in the SterlingPro, more small particles, and still the option for potentially more over extraction or intensity in the coffee. And finally, finishing up on the Bodum. The Bodum is where you're going to get the classic French press flavor. And that's something that I love. It's something that a lot of folks love. French press coffee, again, started off pretty much the way that we're making it, with a Bodum French press, and there is nothing wrong with that. It just so happens that there have been a lot of different advents in technology in French presses as time has gone on, but this again does not mean that any specific way of doing it is wrong nor right. It just has to do with the flavor profile you'll get. So in the Bodum French press, you're going to get that classic, little bitter, very strong French press, maybe a little bit of grit in there. It's just that kind of coffee that, again, it's very true to coffee. You brew for 4 minutes, you press down, you have a cup of French press coffee, and it's going to taste great. So there you have it, guys. Again, I know this was a long video, and I thank you guys for sticking with us, but I think that this is information that is really super important because there are a lot of French press options out there, and they're not all the same. As you can see, specifically, they are not all the same when it comes to their heart, the way that you're going to be brewing your coffee. So I hope you found this useful. Hope you found it informative. But however, if I've missed anything, if there's anything you want to know, or if you just want to leave a comment and tell us what you thought, make sure to get in touch with us in the comments section of this video. Find us on your favorite social media network and get in touch. We always love hearing from you guys here at FrenchPressCoffee.com. As always, everyone, I am Brian with FrenchPressCoffee.com. Until next time, enjoy your cup and take care.
So did you like that video? So go ahead and give us a like. And for more caffeinated videos, why don't you go ahead and subscribe to our channel as well. And if you do, I'll go ahead and give you a nice little coffee quote. Go on, I'll wait. You did it yet? Come on. Ah, there you go. And now for our quote. Remember that if it isn't caffeinated, it ain't coffee.